Hey y'all, welcome back to the Greg Brownderville Dimension. I have a very special episode for you today. Recently, a fellow named Bob Ehlert interviewed me for a podcast called SMU Perspectives. SMU stands for Southern Methodist University, which is a school in Dallas where I teach poetry writing. The conversation that I had with Bob, he was interviewing me, is about my love for poetry, my love for music, the band I play in, Beekeeper Spaceman. We talk about my interest in Welsh mysticism and aesthetics, the concept of Awen, for example. And we get into some very mysterious folklore that lives in the world of my family back in Pumpkin Bend about me and my brother, my father, and my interest in language, the way I engage with language. I think you'll find it interesting. I just want to say a special thanks to Bob and Stephen, Bob Ehlert, the guy who's interviewing me, and his collaborator, Stephen Fasoro with SMU Perspectives. And thanks to them for the interview and for allowing me to repost it here. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, welcome to another episode of SMU Perspectives Podcast, a production of SMU Dallas. I'm Robert Ehlert, the SMU commentary editor. Today, my guest is SMU Professor Greg Brownderville. Before I continue, I have to take a deep breath because what Greg Brownderville has accomplished thus far in his career can only be described as epic. This amazingly creative Southern gentleman from Arkansas, by way of Mississippi, has written 3 award-winning books of poetry, with a new collection on the way. He teaches poetry and creative writing at SMU. In his spare time, he edits Southwest Review, one of the nation's 3 longest-running quarterly literary magazines based right here at SMU. In his spare time, he stoked Firebones, a multiple-medium ghost show extravaganza that weaves folklore, theater, podcast, poetry, film, music, and a quixotic, exotic cast of characters through episodes in the Mississippi Delta and way beyond. And while we're mentioning music, this same Greg Brownderville is the man who wrote the lyrics for a musical piece entitled Ripple the Sky, which premiered with the Los Angeles Philharmonic at the Walt Disney Concert Hall in 2016. There's more. In 2023, Greg teamed up with musical pals to drop a full-length album called Beekeeper Spaceman, which invites us on a dreamy road trip through the uncharted universe. Here's my conversation with Greg. Greg, I'm impressed by the volcanic creativity continually erupting from that mind of yours. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, the love of language, creatively converting that love to art, and where it comes from, that muse, what feeds it, and how can it keep on keeping on. When we talked earlier, you traced some of your artistic gifts back to a head trauma, sensory confusion, word fascination you developed as a youth.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks for the generous introduction. Yeah, this is some kind of fun family folklore, and your guess is as good as mine as to how accurate this is or how much explanatory power it has. But there is some interesting lore in the family. So when my mother was pregnant with my older brother, Eric, my dad was involved in an accident. He was a farmer, and he was up on a tractor, and the tractor exploded and sent him flying through the air a pretty good distance, and he landed out in my grandmother's yard, and he was burnt pretty badly, had serious burns on his face and on his body. He recovered pretty nicely, and so he does, if you see him today, you wouldn't know that his face had been burned, but it was a serious thing and a really traumatic event in the family. And some of the women around Pumpkin Bend, the little community I grew up in, said to my mother, "Oh, Janie, I hope that don't mark that baby." Because there's this folklore around Pumpkin Bend around the idea of marking. That is, that if something dramatic and traumatic happens in the life of a family during a pregnancy, it can mark the child in a mystical way. For example, there are stories around my home county in which a pregnant woman is in a shotgun house and a bull comes up and butts or rams the house, and then the baby is born half human, half cow, and moos instead of cries, this sort of thing. There's a lot of folklore around this back home. Well, when my brother was born, he did, in fact, have a kind of black coloration across the better part of his face that went away, much as my father's burn had healed up. And then I was born 2 years later, and when I was born, shortly after I was born, I was sitting in an infant seat up on the dining room table. And my sister, who was 6 years old, wanted to get up there to talk to me because, there's a new baby in the family and everybody's, cooing at the baby and all that. So she's trying to get up there and she pulls herself up. But what happened is that it caused the table to tip, and I catapulted out of that infant seat and flew through the air, much as my father had flown through the air in this tractor accident. And I hit the kitchen floor and head first and was out like a light. And my parents called some women of the church, and they went up to the church house, which was 3/4 of a mile away, and prayed for me while my family took me to the nearest clinic, which was quite a distance away, and I think 30 minutes or so. When they got me, by the time they got me to the clinic, they put me up on a table, and I had been out cold this entire time, and my parents are freaking out, like they don't know what's going to happen, what has happened to me, and whether I'm going to recover. When they put me up on this table or this surface of some kind, I just came to, and these women had been praying for me back in Pumpkin Bend the whole time. And I came to, and everything seemed fine. And I don't even think they ran any tests or anything. It's like, well, he seems fine. And that was that. There's a country doctor for you. And so that was the first of several pretty serious head injuries that I had in the early years of my life. When one case it was my own fault because I was riding in the bed of my daddy's pickup truck. And I thought, you know what? I can jump out of here and land on my feet. And he was going probably about 15, 20 miles an hour at the time on a paved road. And I jumped out of there and, of course, landed on my head again, just like I had as a child being catapulted out of the infancy. Sounded like a shotgun going off. And these are just two of several. There's several of these. And so the idea in this kind of family lore is, and I mean, I'm not even saying my family all believe this. I mean, it's just sort of a curious story, is that the marking was spread over 2 births. So my brother got the burns, and then I got the catapulting experience, the flying through the air and, being injured. Well, one thing that is a couple of things that are consistent with early head trauma are dysregulation of sleep and sensory confusion, such that you may be presented with a sensory stimulus addressed to the sense of sight, but instead you experience it as 3 other senses plus sight, or you just have like a multi-sensory experience of a sensory stimulus. And these 2 things are deeply true of me and have been the case my entire life. So I've never been able to have like a normal sleeping schedule, like from night to night. Like last night I went to sleep around 3. Tonight I might go to sleep at 11. Tomorrow night I might stay up till 7 a.m. Like it just doesn't, you never know. And I have this sensory confusion. And one thing that has always been a powerful trigger of this multisensory experience is language. So I was obsessed and have been all my life obsessed with words. As a child, I would just, and it wouldn't have to be some exotic word, just be a simple word, but I would just sit and think about the simplest words, but I would be having an experience just thinking about the word. Sometimes I wouldn't even say it out loud, just thinking about it. And I'm having an experience that is sort of psychedelic. It's sort of like walking into an abstract painting that you can touch and that touches you and that you can eat. It's like a dessert, but also tactile and visual and sometimes auditory experience. And then auditory stimuli will often trigger tactile and visual experiences for me. So this has mostly been a blessing, actually. I mean, it is a little annoying if you're like taking a standardized test in high school or something, because you're sitting there trying to get through the material as fast as possible, but the words are on the test are like causing the psychedelic experience, and it's a little bit hard to kind of like shove that away and just focus on doing the sort of boring thing that they want you to do for the test. But for the most part, I've enjoyed it. And I remember as a small child lying in bed late one night, everybody else had gone to sleep. And I remember I was just sitting there thinking about certain words that I liked. And I'd be having these kind of drug like experiences. And I thought to myself, this is a bliss that I'm going to have my whole life. And it's 100% free. I mean, I'm not having to pay for it. I don't really have to work for it. Like, it's just there. And nobody can take it away from me. And I felt that it was actually such a blessing. And really, that's what my poetry comes out of, is just that love of language and the experience that language affords me, or kind of that it's a portal into, the experience that language becomes a portal into. That's really what got me going in poetry. My story's a little different from that of many a colleague of mine in the poetry world, who says, for example, oh, I started reading poetry and I fell in love with poetry and I wanted to write poetry. That's a very common story and a great way to get into poetry. But for me, it's the fascination with the obsession with language came before I even knew anything about poetry.
And I had this extra step, of this experience, and
yeah,
at a time. And your age range in there would have been what?
It does my whole life, because that head injury happened when I was 3 weeks old, the first one. And so who knows, maybe the whole family story about the tractor explosion and the head injuries has nothing to do with this. It may be that it has absolutely nothing to do with it. But whatever caused it, from my earliest memories, this thing about language was there. Like, I remember this from when I was tiny, like baby, basically, I can remember. And so, yeah, that's what it was. I started kind of finger painting with language. I would come up with excuses to use, like, I love to name things, and I would pretend to be, I would try to come up with things that I would need to name just so I could have fun playfully arranging language before I even knew about poetry. And then later I found out about poetry and thought, oh, that's what I'm doing. Like, that's why I love, like, there is this thing called poetry that is the actual art that I'm already engaging in. So for me, doing poetry, loving poetry, really, even though I didn't have the name poetry available to me, started before I was even exposed to poetry.
So this organic situation for you realize, I've got this gift with words and nobody's going to take it away from me. And you started putting poetry together from that point.
I remember coming up with phrases, names, sentences, often just a couple of words together, 2 or 3 words together, basically making little poems before I even knew the word poetry. I mean, I didn't even know about poetry. I mean, my family are not, I have a very musical family, especially on my dad's side, but not really a literary family, So I wasn't exposed to literature as a small child, really. And so this was all happening long before I was exposed to literature. And I didn't even think of it as a gift in the sense of something I'm good at. I thought of it more as something that had just been a delight that was available in the universe. And so it'd be like noticing there were beautiful trees in the woods out behind your house and thinking, like, wow, those trees are just out there. I can go out there and enjoy them any day I want to. Like, I could go spend the afternoon out there among the trees. It's sort of like that. It was just like, there's a thing that's just there that I love, that brings me intense and immense delight, and it's just available for free all the time. That's the way I thought of it.
And you said you remember as a child, you'd be in bed at night thinking about certain words.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you started to put some of those dots together and form.
Yeah, like they were
whether
chemical.
You knew it or not.
Yeah, it was like chemical reactions. Like, okay, so if you think if you put the word, like I loved the word pie, Pie, and so I might sit there and think, and I also loved the word the. Strangely enough, there was somebody in my family had a cologne that to me smelled like the word the. I remember that, and I remember thinking about that a lot, and that because it was like in this cologne. I don't even know if anybody really used it, but it was like in the cabinet in one of the bathrooms, and so I noticed that it was in there, and I was curious about it just as a little kid, like, what is this, you know? And when I smelled it, I thought, oh, it smells like the word the. Like I remember thinking that, and so whatever, like I would have some word in mind, the or pie or the word Swiss or I remember loving this is a strange one. I actually like the word product, um, and so I would be thinking about whatever this word was, whatever was the word of the day that I was obsessed with, and thinking about the all the delight that it brought me. But then at some point I thought, but if you put that one next to this other one that I like, you get it changes both words, and often it would create like an interesting spatial play, like a spatial dimension where it would seem that the word would be tiny and then impossibly vast and kind of expand and contract. I would notice that when you put words next to each other, you could change the colors and textures or the spatial dimensions and that kind of thing. And that was really the first act of writing poetry, even though I didn't know what to call it. It was just, oh, you put this one next to this one, you get a different, you mix the colors or the taste or the textures or the spatial dimensions start playing around, start moving around. And, it was like having like as if you just got Adobe Premiere Pro as a filmmaker and you're like, oh, look at this feature. Like, oh, look at what this does. This changes you put this LUT on there and you get a different color to all the imagery in this scene, like the way filmmakers play with features that are available through software. It's almost like that.
So your fascination with these words, and you began to connect the dots, and at some point you're writing poems, and you make the leap to actually doing a collection of poems. And I want to take this opportunity for you to read one of them, and just to give people an idea where you're at. This comes from the collection called Gust. And if you want to set up a little bit about thematically what's going on in Gust, and then you're going to read the poem Art in Heaven.
Art in Heaven, yeah. I was thinking about the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And art there is obviously a verb, but I was thinking about art as an art that you make as an artist. And the reason I was thinking of this is that I was having some fun playing around with some theological ideas that had occurred to me, because I noticed growing up that there would be, it's funny, the theologians in my world when I was growing up were the children, because I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and Pentecostals, country Pentecostals, at least where I grew up, they are not much into theology. They're more into experience. Like experiencing communion with the divine is the name of the game. Not so much talking about it, explaining it, anatomizing it, And it reminds me of a story I read in a book by Joseph Campbell, the mythologist. He said that he and some other scholars from, I think mostly from the United States, but maybe from around the world, were in Japan studying Shinto. And they had been there for a couple of weeks. And one of the scholars who were visiting was a theologian. And after a couple of weeks, the theologian said to the Shinto priest, we've thoroughly enjoyed these ceremonies that you do and all the dancing and all that, and it's beautiful, and I'm a theologian, so now I'm wondering, like, what is the theology? And the Shinto priest, who was loath to disappoint a guest, said, after reflecting on it for a moment, I think we have no theology, we dance. And this makes me think of the Pentecostals I grew up around. It's more like we dance, we shout, we we commune with the divine and through an ecstatic experience. But children, and my brother and I, for example, would have deep theological, like, I remember discussions we had that we were puzzling over points of theology, and I now know that these same debates we were having were debates that were had like in the early church, among the early church fathers, and or maybe during the high medieval period. Similar debates were being had amongst scholars and theologians. So one thing that came up in some of our discussions there amongst the child theologians was why was it necessary for Christ to die to atone for the sins of the world? Like, if you're God, can't you come up with another way that doesn't involve, somebody being tortured and killed? That puzzled us. And we asked some of the adults, and the explanations were not satisfactory in the least. So at some point, as I became a writer and was really thinking a lot about how to make a piece of writing good, it occurred to me that if you imagine God as a kind of poet and the universe as a poem in progress, like a poem that's in progress, like it's not finished yet, it's being written, and we are characters in that poem, then you can explain some things. So I had this idea, like, okay, in Genesis, creation looks like a speech act. Let there be such and such. Let there be such and such. So in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In Greek, this word logos. So it's the idea that there is this literariness to the creation itself. So I thought, okay, so what if the God poet is writing the universe? He's just trying to write a good story. So there's going to be pain and suffering. Because, like if you went to the movies tonight and the story had no pain and suffering and there's no conflict and everybody's doing great, you probably just walk out because it'd be so boring. There has to be some tension and some friction and some conflict and some suffering in most stories. It's a threat, at least, of some kind. So I was thinking, okay, so the God poet's writing this. He's writing the universe. By the way, this idea of the literariness of the universe is alive in many a mythology, not just the Hebrew mythology. And so at some point, it comes to his attention that these characters in the story are actually sentient beings, and that when he makes them suffer, they really suffer. Like, what if Shakespeare had found out that King Lear was alive and sentient and feeling all that misery that he was you then feel sort of a moral obligation that would run counter to your aesthetic obligation, because as an artist, you have an aesthetic burden. I have to make this a good and beautiful piece of art. But if you're now thinking of it morally, like, but I don't want to make these poor characters suffer. This is terrible. Then you have to come up with a way of alleviating the suffering that doesn't ruin the story. Okay, so then the appearance of Christ and the suffering and death of Christ would be a way of having the tragedy continue as tragedy in one dimension, but also afford the possibility of a happy ending, of a resolution, of some kind of redemption, something like that. And so these were the thoughts that I was entertaining when I wrote this poem. And I'm not propounding this as some kind of like, oh, here is the theology that people should. I'm not trying to get anybody to believe any of this, but I'm just saying it's an interesting idea. And so that's where this poem came from. Art in Heaven. Fishermen lift their question marks from the lake in sudden rain. The clean horizon line, a perfect moon, and its reflection make an obelisk, a great division sign. By the shore I walk this glistening road alone, singing against the wind's delirious keening of the glad primal I am. Divine breath, by wizardry of words, gave life to man to complicate the tale. In the beginning was poetry, then God invented death. There were shadows, there were shivering and prayer. Tatterdemalions crammed inside a cave, we smelled of our kill and richly of our maker. The firelight deemed us lovely, fit to save. I could reforest Eden with a phrase. Declare the cursive honeysuckle law, he thought. But easy mercy would have marred his poem, and he refused to compromise, too proud to play the deus ex machina. How can I save my creatures and my art? My God, I feel him live, I feel him die. Arrows of rain, a lightning claw takes hold of a leafless tree to shake hands in the sky. Some strange white thing, as if the gush of road were a gentle river, makes a mad descent through blue-gray light and crashes, bleeds, transforms. Gravity panicked at the pavement's edge. The bird is a book, flapping in the wind. Tomorrow, crazed black flies will come in swarms, characters loose and hungry for a page.
Thank you for that. There's nothing like a poet reading poetry. I mean, you hear a lot of people quote poets and whatnot, but I can tell that was multidimensional for you to put that out there. And so you teach poetry to SMU students.
Mm-hmm.
You choose poetry to publish in Southwest Review. I realize you've been playing music since you were a boy, but is poetry the go-to connective tissue of your creativity? Is that the thing that is always going on that outside lane, no matter what else is going on?
Yeah, it is the constant, and it's the most elemental, because, like Wordsworth used to wander the Lake District and write poems. He didn't even need any technology, not even a paper and pen. The whole thing can happen. It's just language. It's it's in your body. And so I like the elemental quality of poetry, but music runs very deep with me, and it's hard for me to say, one runs deeper than the other, but I guess poetry is the one that I'm always doing no matter what. But I mean, I remember writing songs when I was 8 years old. So I mean, that goes way back too. And there was more music in my family than poetry. As I say, all the Brownderville males, from the oldest to the youngest, play music. Every single one of them, and several of the women, but all of the males play music. And yeah, we just, to this day, I mean, I'm going to see my family next week, and I guarantee you we're going to, I won't have been there 2 hours till we'll have broken out guitars and we'll be singing, playing music. So that one runs deep too. My dad taught me to play, so.
So there's this nagging question I have about creatives. You put in the work, you stay with it, you complete the work. Many of us could follow those initial steps, but artists such as yourself also find the confidence and courage to put it out there. I was really stuck on this point until I'd listened to one of your recent podcasts on the Greg Brownderville dimension, which is pretty cool. In this May 2024 episode, you discussed Welsh magic and Awen, the special Welsh concept related to inspiration. And I'll let you explain how Awen plays a role with artists and how you have merged it with things learned, like in that book, Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke.
Yeah.
So take me there.
Yeah, Awen is a special Welsh idea. It's a Welsh word, Awen, A-W-E-N, and it means something like, my definition of it would be the imagination of spirituality and the spirituality of imagination. It's related to these similar concepts in other languages, like in Hebrew, ruach, the spirit of the breath of life, or pneuma in Greek, or Atman in the Sanskrit traditions, this idea of breath or wind as being somehow the thing that conjures in this universe and conjures the universe, actually. And so, like in the Christian tradition in Acts chapter 2, there's a mighty rushing wind that turns out to be the Holy Ghost, and then people speak. And so there's this tie-in between this wind, this mysterious wind, and the breath, and that makes us think of Genesis. The Spirit of God moved upon the deep, and things started happening. The universe began to happen. Well, in Welsh, there's an idea that the fairies, the Tylwyth Teg, as they're known in Welsh, are closely associated with Awen. They sort of come from the land of Awen. And some stories in the Welsh folkloric tradition suggest that if you can find this certain patch of earth somewhere in Wales, sometimes it's said to be in the grounds of the St. David's Cathedral in Pembrokeshire. Some people say it's in a small village called Chemais. But there's this small piece of turf. I'm talking about like a piece of ground just big enough for you to stand on. If you're standing there, you look out and you can see the magical land of the fairies, the world of Awen. But you can't have two people on there at the same time. If someone else steps on that ground with you, now neither one of you can see it. This has to be experienced alone. You have to experience it alone if you're going to experience it at all. And the thing that struck me about this is that if you stepped onto that piece of ground and you suddenly saw the land of the Tylwyth Teg, this enchanted island, nobody has to tell you that you saw it. You know something happened. And this brings me back to what I was saying about Christian worshipers who are into the ecstatic mode of worship. It's like you're looking for an experience that affirms the divine. And this is what happens with this stepping on this patch of turf. And it makes me think of what Rilke says in his wonderful book, Letters to a Young Poet. He writes this when he's 27 years old. You read the thing, you can't believe this guy's 27. He's writing to a younger poet named Capus, who was only 19 at the time, and who was attending a school that Rilke had attended when he was that age. So Rilke says to Capus, he says, if your everyday life seems poor, don't blame it, blame yourself. Admit to yourself that you are not enough of a poet to call forth its riches, because to the Creator there is no poverty and no poor, indifferent place. And even if you found yourself in some prison, wouldn't you still have your childhood, that jewel beyond all price, that treasure house of memories? Turn your attention to it and try to raise up this enormous, the sunken feelings, I think Rilke says, of this enormous past. And if from this turning within, this immersion in your own world, poems come, then you will not think of asking anyone whether they're good or not, nor will you try to interest magazines in these works, for you will see them as your dear natural possession, a piece of your life, a voice from it. And that, I think, is what every artist is looking for, or should be looking for. It doesn't mean that you don't put in your time as an apprentice and learn the discipline. I mean, the Welsh bards, for example, were extremely disciplined and had to learn these very complicated, demanding metrical systems and ways of writing poetry. But ultimately, you have to be standing on that magical turf alone, looking out, and that's when you see the magical city. And yeah, I really believe in that.
And therein comes the validation that what I have just created, go with it.
Yeah. Just like he said, ain't nobody got to tell you something happened. and you experienced that enchantment, you know it. Marilyn Robinson came to SMU my first year on campus, and I asked her how she teaches creative writing. She did teach, at least at that time, may still, I don't know, at the University of Iowa, which is the #1 creative writing program by most people's reckoning. And she said, I'm not so much on the nuts and bolts. Now, as a teacher, let it be said, I kind of am. Like, I'll get in there and talk to them about the nuts and bolts. But I always keep in mind this other side of teaching that Marilyn Robinson was speaking to. She said, I talk to my students about states. Like, what state of soul are you in when you did your best work? Because when you did your best work, you knew the manna was falling from heaven. Like, you knew that it was a gift. It was coming. Like, something magical was happening in that moment. So pay attention to how you were living when that happened. Like, how much sleep did you get the night before that happened? What did you eat that day? What kinds of media did you consume? What kinds of people had you been spending time with, or had you been alone? Like, what were the conditions that conduced to the materialization of a moment in which you could do your finest work and you knew that it was good? You were standing on that magical piece of earth. And so how did you get there? And so that's the way she tries to help her students reflect on that. Yeah, and that's you'll have that confidence when you know that you've been there.
That was so helpful to hear those two things and to hear them put together, because I can understand now where a new poet has doubts.
Yeah.
But if you kind of go through the checks and check everything down, as you have just described, you should come out of that with the confidence that I can put this out there.
Yeah, and it's funny that you're asking me these questions, because just last night I was hanging out with my friend Tarfia Faizullah, who's a very successful poet, very good poet, and we were talking about this very topic. And we were both saying that there's almost a kind of delusional tendency that an artist will tend to have. Or a certain kind of naivete where you think, yeah, I can be a poet. Like, it's sort of an absurd proposition. Like, what? You're going to be a poet? That's going to be your life? It sounds ridiculous to anybody you say that to, particularly when you're 15 years old or 23 years old. And Tarfia said something that is very memorable. She said, yeah, it's like you have to be so delusional that you will stay in that delusion sort of innocently and naively until it starts paying off and the delusion becomes real, you know? And like, I remember one time I needed to go to Love Field Airport, and I was on campus, and I thought, well, let me just park my car here and I'll just leave it here while I'm away, and I'll just Uber from campus to the airport. And this older gentleman was driving the Uber. He came and picked me up. I don't think he looked at me. He just thought, I'm on the SMU campus, I'm picking up a student. I think that's what he thought. And so we drove off, and he said, well, young man, what are you studying to be? What are you hoping to become? And I thought, well, I'm just going to go with it. And so I said, well, I'm studying to be a poet. I want to be a poet. He was like, he said he wants to be a poet. He's like, no, really, what do you think? What are you going to be? And I was like, no, I'm serious. I want to be a poet. He realized that I wasn't joking. He said, well, good luck with that. You know, it was just a ridiculous proposition.
Well, here's the proof. You just finished your 4th collection of poems. So we'll have to go back and find that guy. Tell me about that 4th book. How did it come about? Where did it take you, and where might it take us? What's going on there?
Yeah, and this book does not have a publisher, so I have no idea when it'll be out, but because I'm just now in the process of thinking about which publishers I should send it to. But it's a book that actually ties in with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, because all my life I've had this voice going in my mind that is not in normal English. Like, it's a kind of English, but it's kind of garbled, like kind of mangled, and seems almost sort of brain damage sounding voice. but there's something about it that I like. And people who really, really know me, like spend a ton of time around me, they'll know about this voice because I will speak in it from time to time. And so my mother knew about it, and she used to kind of playfully engage with me when I was in that mode. But I had never written poems in that voice. And then when I was working on this new book, I noticed I was just writing the whole thing, like poem after poem in that voice. This sort of like mangled, messed up English where it's like tons of mistakes. Like often the wrong word occurs to me. And so I've wondered whether the head injuries that I sustained as a child, it was messing with my linguistic faculties, but I figured out like a workaround so I can speak something approximating standard American English, but there's still that other voice over there that's kind of in the secret chamber of my life. And this book is really written in that voice, the entire book. And it will bother people, I think. Like, I think I'll get some negative criticism because it will be kind of a destabilizing experience for the reader. Because generally speaking, when you have some sort of non-normative voice in a poem, like something that doesn't seem weird in the way that poetry is weird, but seems kind of like the verbal equivalent of the work of self-taught visual artists. You know, what they call outsider art in the South, for example. It's like you realize this is someone who did not go to art school. This person is not sophisticated in the conventional sense of sophistication. And you're kind of alone with that weirdness and warpedness, and you have to kind of find your way as the person appreciating the art. That's the way this book is. Generally speaking, in poetry, if there's some voice like that happening in the poem, there'll be another smart person voice that's kind of interpreting it or bouncing off it. Sometimes in a way that strikes me as a little bit condescending, but just, there'll be this weirdo voice that seems unsophisticated, and then this other voice assuring you that the poet is smart and can reflect on this and comment on it and help you understand. But this book does not give you that other voice. It only gives you the warped voice. Mm. And so I think there will be some negative critiques because people just will not know what to do with that. But that's the book I wanted to write, so I'm hoping I can find a publisher for it.
Okay, Greg, I'm going to transition just a little bit. How can a storyteller and poet and professor and editor also create such pleasing and sophisticated music? I mean, Beekeeper Spaceman is chock full of great vocals and musicianship.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that was one of the most fulfilling creative projects I've ever worked on. I did it with a guy named Spencer Kinney, who's a local performing artist, musician, songwriter, singer. And Spencer and I met when I was working on Firebones because he started working with me on the sound design of Firebones. And then we started making music together. And we just have a really, really good rapport as musicians. Like, we understand each other and we are able to work together really, really well. And I love what he brings to the songs. And so, it was just one of those easy collabs. Like, it was not hard. It just sort of happened. I mean, we didn't even know we were working on an album. We just started doing some songs, and next thing you knew, we had an album's worth. And I've been playing music my whole life and recording music, so there wasn't a big learning curve. I mean, I've been writing songs and recording my whole life, so I knew how to do that stuff. It's just finding people that you really work with well and easily and naturally. That's the struggle.
Well, it's working for me because after I listen to new music, and if I like it, I can't shake it. It loops in my head for hours and days later, and it becomes kind of a subconscious soundtrack for big chunks of my day. Mm-hmm. And that's what was happening, especially with this one particular song, In the Custody of Stars.
Yeah.
There was just such a nice round with your guitars and a build-up that took you someplace. And there's a story going on there, too, and I'll let people determine that for themselves.
And they can find this whole album on Spotify, or if you love vinyl, you can order the deluxe vinyl edition with some beautiful visual art by Kylie Rose Parrish, who did the visual art for Firebones as well. And this
it was a very wonderful production, and I'm glad I stumbled onto you and that. So, but this leap from poetry to lyrics to musical composition, how does that happen, or is it just all flowing from the same spigot?
Yeah, it's kind of the same deal. I mean, there are some challenges unique to each art form. Like with writing lyrics and music, when you're writing the lyrics for music, you have to write something that's singable, and your imagery needs to communicate immediately. It needs to have that immediacy to it. Like that poem, Art in Heaven, is doing this complicated stuff with like imagining a division sign as being like, um, like the moon above a lake and then the reflection of the moon. But imagine trying to do that in a song. You could, but it would be, you're having to put so much kind of visual infrastructure in place to get that image to click into place. It could possibly happen in a song, but there are some images that you can get to work in a poem that would be it would almost seem laborious, and it's like the imagery in a song needs to be kind of immediate and like quickly executed, and it has to be singable. So consonant clusters will be very awkward in the throat, or like they're hard to sing. There's a lot of language that will work in a poem that's completely unsingable. You try to sing it and it just feels like you got a mouthful of peanut butter or something. Like you just can't sing it because you have to kind of open up, and so it's a challenge getting the language to work in a song. But because of melisma, you can make one word be like 5 syllables if you sing it a certain, you can stretch it out. So there's certain things you can do in song that would be difficult to pull off in a poem. So I really enjoy both, but they're historically related. The ancient Greeks didn't even, musica in ancient Greece was dance, music, and poetry all as one art form. So,
well, it's working for you.
And thanks, Bob. I appreciate it.
I want to thank you so much for coming in today and joining
My pleasure.
us. We've gained a lot of insights into how you manage and render that cauldron of creativity that comes your way, and we're blessed by your artistic contributions. But before we go, I want to thank my SMU Perspectives colleague, engineer Stephen Fasaro, and I'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was recorded at the SMU Fondren Library Podcasting Studio, which is a collaboration between SMU Libraries and the Office of Engaged Learning. So we have a musical lead-in and end that we normally use, but what we're going to do at this point is play an audio clip of In the Custody of Stars. And I'm going to share what I just thought was a wonderful piece and see how others feel about it. And so,
thank you, Bob. Thanks for inviting me. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you all next time.
I'm one smithereen, blown clear out of focus. I'm floating alone, I'm lost in your land. So much goes unseen, I live in your book of just color and tone. Don't think of me now or my sins. I caught a moon canoe from Canaan. I caused you pain, I know I do. I'm far away, too gone for saving. Out here in the blue,